Commander Jake Morrison stood at the observation window of the diplomatic vessel Horizon and watched the massive space station grow larger with each passing moment. Beside him stood Lisa Grant, the chief science officer who had spent her entire career dreaming of this moment. Danny Brooks, the security chief, checked his weapon for the third time that morning even though he knew they wouldn't need it. This was supposed to be a peaceful meeting. This was supposed to be humanity's greatest achievement. Earth had finally made contact with the Galactic Council, and these three individuals were chosen to represent their entire species before the most powerful organization in the known universe. The space station was unlike anything they had ever seen. It orbited a neutron star called Zenith 7, and the structure itself seemed to defy the laws of physics. Towers of crystal and metal stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Ships from dozens of different species docked at various ports, each vessel more exotic than the last. Lisa pressed her hand against the window and felt tears forming in her eyes. Humanity had finally made it. They were no longer alone in the universe. They had neighbors now, friends perhaps, and a chance to learn from civilizations that had existed for millions of years. The docking procedure took less than an hour. Council representatives met them at the airlock, strange beings that communicated through translators attached to their bodies. A tall insectoid creature with 6 arms gestured for them to follow. They walked through corridors filled with species they couldn't name, past rooms where business they couldn't understand was being conducted. Jake noticed that many of the aliens stopped to stare at them. Some looked curious. Others looked afraid. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the mission. They were here to apply for membership in the Galactic Council. They were here to secure humanity's future among the stars. The council chamber was enormous. 73 seats arranged in a perfect circle, each one occupied by a representative from a different species. At the center stood a raised platform where Jake and his team were directed to wait. High above them, a massive crystalline being materialized out of thin air. The translator in Jake's ear identified the creature as Prime Arbiter Thexular, the leader of the Galactic Council for the past 4,000 years. The being's voice echoed through the chamber like breaking glass, cold and emotionless as it spoke. Humanity's application for council membership had been reviewed. Their history had been studied. Their technology had been analyzed. Their culture had been examined in detail. The conclusion was unanimous. Humanity posed an unacceptable risk to galactic peace and stability. Jake felt his stomach drop. Lisa grabbed his arm. Danny took a step forward but stopped when council guards moved to intercept him. This couldn't be happening. They had come in peace. They had offered friendship and cooperation. What had they done wrong? Thexular continued speaking as holographic displays filled the chamber. Images of human warfare flickered into existence. The world wars, nuclear explosions, environmental destruction, species extinction, religious conflicts, political violence. Every dark moment in human history was laid bare before the council. The crystalline being explained that humanity had demonstrated consistent patterns of aggression, territorial expansion, and violence against their own kind. If humans behaved this way toward each other, how would they behave toward alien species? The risk was too great. The decision had been made. Jake found his voice and began to argue. He explained that humanity had learned from their mistakes. He pointed out that they had achieved global peace in the past century. He noted that every species must have gone through similar growing pains. Lisa supported him with scientific data, showing humanity's capacity for cooperation and innovation. Danny stood silent but ready, his eyes scanning the room for threats that were already materializing. None of it mattered. The council had already decided humanity's fate before the meeting even began. The sentence was called planetary sterilization. Jake didn't understand the term at first. Lisa's face went pale as the translation reached her. Danny's hand moved toward his weapon before he realized how useless it would be. Thexular explained the process without emotion or mercy. A weapon called the Void Hammer would be deployed. Earth would not be destroyed. It would be erased. The planet would be removed from space-time itself, along with every human living on it. The few thousand humans scattered across space stations and distant colonies would be allowed to live, but they would serve as a warning to other developing species. This is what happened to civilizations that could not control their violent nature. Jake lunged forward and was immediately restrained by council guards. He screamed at Thexular, calling him a murderer, a coward, a monster hiding behind laws and procedures. Lisa collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably as she thought of her family back on Earth. Danny fought against the guards holding him until they activated some kind of neural suppressor that left him frozen in place. The council watched without sympathy. They had made difficult decisions before. This was just another necessary action to preserve galactic peace. Humanity would be remembered as a cautionary tale, nothing more. They were dragged back to their ship and sealed inside. The Horizon systems activated automatically, pulling them away from the station. Jake rushed to the observation deck despite his injuries. Lisa and Danny joined him. Together they watched as the Void Hammer activated. They couldn't see the weapon itself, but they could see its effect. Back in their home system, millions of kilometers away, Earth simply stopped existing. One moment it was there, a blue marble spinning in the darkness. The next moment there was nothing. Just empty space where their world had been. 9 billion people gone in an instant. Every city, every forest, every ocean, every mountain, every memory, all of it erased as if it had never existed. The psychic shockwave hit them seconds later. Jake felt something tear inside his mind. A connection to billions of other humans that he never knew existed until it was severed. Lisa screamed and pressed her hands against her head. Danny stood motionless, tears streaming down his face as his mouth moved in silent agony. They felt every death simultaneously. They felt their species nearly wink out of existence. They felt the weight of 9 billion souls crying out and then falling silent forever. The Horizon drifted through space, its 3 occupants broken and traumatized beyond measure. Hours passed before any of them could speak. Jake finally broke the silence. His voice was rough and damaged from screaming. He made a vow that Lisa and Danny would remember for the rest of their lives. Humanity would survive. They would grow stronger. They would hide in the darkness and build their strength. And one day, when the council had forgotten about them, when they believed the human threat was eliminated, they would return. They would make the council understand what they had done. They would make them pay for every single life that was stolen. The age of human weakness had ended. The age of human vengeance had begun. The survivors called it the Exodus, though there was nowhere to go and no promised land waiting for them. 5,312 humans scattered across 72 different star systems, each group isolated and terrified and barely clinging to survival. Most of them were miners, scientists, or explorers who happened to be away from Earth when the Void Hammer erased their homeworld. They had minimal supplies, outdated equipment, and no central leadership to coordinate their efforts. Within the first year, half of them were dead. Within 5 years, only 1,200 remained. Humanity stood at the edge of extinction, and the universe didn't care. Jake Morrison took command of the largest surviving group, nearly 200 people hiding in an asteroid mining station near Kepler 442. The station was never meant to support so many people for extended periods. Life support systems strained under the load. Food production was barely sufficient. Radiation shielding was inadequate. People were dying from diseases that would have been easily treated on Earth. Children cried for parents who would never return. Adults stared at empty walls and waited for death. Jake knew they couldn't stay in the station, but he also knew they had nowhere else to go. Lisa Grant became humanity's memory. She worked 20 hours a day downloading and preserving every piece of human knowledge she could access from distant servers and databases. Literature, science, history, art, music, philosophy, engineering, medicine. She saved it all before the data degraded or was lost forever. Her hands shook as she worked, and she rarely slept or ate. Danny Brooks had to force her to rest, physically carrying her away from her computer terminal when she refused to stop. She would scream at him that she was losing data, that entire libraries were disappearing, that if she didn't save it, then humanity's culture would die along with Earth. He held her while she cried and then brought her back to work when she was ready. Danny organized the survivors into something resembling a military unit. Everyone over the age of 12 received basic combat training. Everyone learned how to handle weapons, how to operate in zero gravity, how to survive in hostile environments. Some people protested that they were scientists or engineers, not soldiers. Danny explained that it didn't matter what they used to be. The council had declared humanity too dangerous to exist, which meant any survivors would be hunted down and eliminated if discovered. They needed to be able to fight. They needed to be able to hide. They needed to become something the council would never expect. After 3 months of desperate searching, they found New Haven. It was an ice world in the Kepler 442 system, far beyond Council space and hidden behind radiation clouds that made sensor detection nearly impossible. The planet was barely habitable, with surface temperatures that dropped to -200 degrees and constant storms that could strip flesh from bone. But beneath the ice were geothermal vents and vast caverns warmed by the planet's core. They could survive there. More importantly, they could hide there. Jake made the decision to relocate everyone, knowing that some would die during the journey, but also knowing that staying in the exposed mining station meant certain death for everyone. The migration took 6 weeks and cost them 40 lives. Ships broke down in transit. Life support systems failed. Accidents happened that would have been preventable with proper equipment and training. They buried their dead in space, wrapped in whatever material could be spared, and kept moving forward because stopping meant giving up. When they finally reached New Haven and descended through the frozen atmosphere, Lisa looked out at the gray wasteland and wondered if they had escaped death or simply chosen a slower way to die. Jake squeezed her shoulder and told her that slow death was still life, and life meant hope. They carved their first settlement out of ice and stone, using mining equipment that was never designed for construction work. The caverns were dark and cold despite the geothermal vents. Water had to be melted from ice and carefully purified. Food came from hydroponic gardens that struggled in the low light conditions. Every resource was precious and nothing could be wasted. People wore the same clothes for months until they fell apart. Injuries went untreated because medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Children were born in the darkness and knew nothing of blue skies or green forests. This was humanity now, huddled in a frozen cave at the edge of known space, praying that the Council would never find them. Years passed and became decades. Jake Morrison grew old watching over his people, his hair turning white and his body failing even as his determination never wavered. Lisa Grant's vast libraries of human knowledge became the foundation of their education system, teaching new generations about the world they had lost and the civilization they needed to rebuild. Danny Brooks trained soldiers who had never known peace, warriors who understood that their entire existence was preparation for a conflict that might not come for generations. The three of them became legends, the founders who refused to let humanity die, and when they finally passed away, their children and grandchildren continued their work. The population remained dangerously low for the first 3 centuries. Genetic diversity was a constant concern, and careful breeding programs were necessary to prevent inbreeding and inherited diseases. They established strict protocols for reproduction, matching partners based on genetic compatibility rather than personal preference. It was cold and calculating and absolutely necessary for survival. Some people rebelled against the system. Some couples had unauthorized children. The community dealt with these situations as gently as possible, but the rules existed for a reason. Humanity was one plague or disaster away from extinction, and they couldn't afford to take chances. But humans adapted because they always had. Children born in the darkness developed enhanced night vision. People who spent their lives in reduced gravity became taller and leaner. Genetic modifications, carefully applied over generations, enhanced their intelligence and physical capabilities. They weren't trying to become something other than human. They were trying to become the best possible version of humanity that could survive in conditions that would kill anyone from old Earth. By the year 3000, New Haven housed 50,000 people living in vast underground cities carved from ice and stone. Other colonies were rediscovered as communication networks slowly expanded across the darkness. A mining outpost on Europa had survived by hiding in the ice oceans. A research station near Alpha Centauri had managed to terraform a small moon. A generation ship that was launched before the erasure arrived at its destination and found a barely habitable world to call home. Each group had their own story of survival and their own innovations. Together, they represented 3 million humans scattered across a dozen hidden worlds, invisible to the Council, and growing stronger with each passing year. Technology advanced slowly but steadily. Human scientists studied every piece of Council equipment they could salvage from abandoned outposts and derelict ships. They learned how the Council's faster-than-light drives worked and built their own versions. They discovered the principles behind energy shields and weapons systems. They developed new materials and manufacturing techniques that pushed beyond what either human or Council technology could achieve separately. A young researcher named Claire Davis descended from Lisa Grant's bloodline, made a breakthrough that changed everything when she discovered that Council sensors had a fundamental blind spot in quantum space. Humanity could hide in the spaces between spaces, in the shadows where Council eyes couldn't see. By the year 5000, humanity had transformed from desperate survivors into something unprecedented. 3 billion humans lived in the darkness between stars, their cities and stations invisible to the Council's sophisticated detection networks. They had fleets of warships built in hidden shipyards carved into asteroids. They had weapons that made the Void Hammer look primitive. They had soldiers who had trained their entire lives for combat. They had scientists who understood Council technology better than the Council did. Most importantly, they had patience and they had purpose. The Council had tried to erase them and failed. Now it was time to show the galaxy what humanity had become in the long night. Admiral Peter Kane stood on the bridge of his flagship Retribution and looked at the holographic display showing 3,000 warships, hidden in the shadows of a massive nebula called the Bell. Each ship represented years of labor, millions of tons of resources, and the collective determination of a species that refused to die. Beside him stood General Nicole Harper, commander of the Human Liberation Army, and Dr. Simon Wells, head of the Advanced Weapons Division. Together they represented the 3 pillars of humanity's return: military force, ground operations, and technological superiority. The year was 5127, exactly 3,000 years since Earth's erasure, and the time for hiding had finally ended. The War Council had been debating strategy for months. Some argued for a direct assault on Council headquarters, a devastating strike that would decapitate their leadership in a single blow. Others suggested a campaign of terrorism, hitting civilian targets to create fear and chaos. Peter rejected both approaches. He wanted the Council to understand what was happening to them. He wanted them to feel terror building slowly as humanity dismantled their empire piece by piece. He wanted them to know that the species they tried to erase had become their worst nightmare. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about sending a message that would echo through the galaxy for millennia. No species could ever again be erased without consequences. Nicole Harper presented the operational plan to the assembled fleet commanders. 70 Council listening posts scattered across the frontier would be struck simultaneously. Each post monitored a different sector of space, watching for threats and coordinating Council military response. The posts were lightly defended because the Council had faced no serious military opposition in over 1,000 years. They had grown complacent in their power, confident that their technology and numbers made them invincible. They had forgotten that the most dangerous enemy was the one you believed was already dead. Nicole explained that destroying all 70 posts simultaneously would blind the Council to an entire region of space while demonstrating that humanity could strike anywhere at any time. Dr. Wells unveiled the weapons that would make it possible. Quantum disruptor missiles that could slip through Council shields by existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, antimatter warheads powerful enough to crack moons, nanite swarms that could disassemble ships at the molecular level, energy weapons that fired faster than the speed of light. Humanity had spent 3,000 years studying Council technology and then surpassing it. Every weapon was tested and refined until it achieved perfection. Every system had multiple redundancies. They wouldn't get a second chance at this, so the first strike needed to be absolutely devastating. The assembled commanders listened in silence and then began planning their individual missions. The attack was scheduled for August 15th, the anniversary of Earth's erasure. Peter wanted the symbolism to be clear. 3,000 years ago on this date, the Council erased 9 billion humans from existence. Today, humanity would begin erasing the Council's empire. The fleet dispersed across hundreds of light years, each battle group moving to their designated target. They traveled through quantum shadows, invisible to Council sensors, emerging only when they reached striking distance. The coordination required was incredible. 70 different groups needed to attack at exactly the same moment, despite being spread across vast distances. A single early strike would alert the Council and ruin the entire operation. Peter watched the countdown timer on his display. 10 minutes until the strike. He thought about Jake Morrison and Lisa Grant and Danny Brooks, the founders who kept humanity alive during the darkest times. He thought about the billions who died when Earth vanished and the millions more who died during the long centuries of hiding. He thought about his own daughter, growing up in the darkness of New Haven, asking him why they had to hide if humans hadn't done anything wrong. He told her that sometimes the strong punished the weak just for being different. He promised her that one day humans would be strong enough to stand in the light again. Today he would begin keeping that promise. The timer reached 0. Across 70 star systems, human warships emerged from quantum space and opened fire. The listening posts never had a chance. Most were destroyed before they could even send distress signals. The few that managed to transmit were jammed by human electronic warfare systems. Within 17 minutes, every target was eliminated. No survivors, no evidence. Just empty space where Council installations used to exist. The fleet commanders reported successful strikes across the board. Not a single human ship was lost. The first blow had been struck perfectly, and the Council still didn't know what hit them. Then came the message. Simon Wells had prepared it carefully, working with historians and linguists to craft something that would resonate across the galaxy. Every Council communication array, every data network, every holographic display across 1,000 worlds suddenly broadcast the same content. First came an image of Earth as it looked moments before its destruction, blue and beautiful and alive. Then came footage of the Void Hammer activation and Earth's erasure. Then came images of human suffering during the long years of hiding. Finally came a simple message in every Council language. We remember, we return. We are humanity. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The Council leadership had believed humanity extinct for 3,000 years. They were a historical footnote, a cautionary tale about dealing with primitive species. Now they were back and demonstrating military capabilities that exceeded anything the Council possessed. Panic spread across Council territories. Civilian populations demanded answers. Military commanders called for emergency mobilization. Political factions began blaming each other for the catastrophe. Prime Arbiter Thexler, the same crystalline being who ordered Earth's erasure millennia ago, called an emergency session of the Council to address the crisis. Peter Kane watched the Council's response through intercepted communications and allowed himself a slight smile. They were behaving exactly as predicted. The Council's first instinct was to send a military force to investigate and eliminate the threat. They still believed they were dealing with a minor uprising that could be crushed with superior numbers. They didn't understand that humanity had spent 3,000 years preparing for this moment. They didn't understand that the species hiding in the darkness had become predators, while the Council grew soft behind their shields and laws. They would learn. Peter would teach them. The Council's Fifth Fleet was dispatched to the frontier with orders to locate and destroy all human forces. 200 warships under the command of War Marshal Krentok of the Vaxian Imperium, considered one of the finest military commanders in Council history. His fleet was equipped with the latest technology and manned by veteran crews from a dozen different species. They jumped into the frontier region expecting to face a ragtag group of human survivors with outdated weapons. Instead, they found 500 human warships waiting in perfect formation, their weapons charged and their shields at maximum power. Krentok barely had time to register the trap before the humans opened fire. The battle lasted 17 minutes. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. Human ships moved faster than Council vessels could track. Human weapons punched through Council shields like they weren't there. Human tactics were flawless, coordinated through quantum communication networks that the Council couldn't jam or intercept. Every Council ship that tried to retreat was hunted down and destroyed. Every distress signal was blocked. When it was over, the entire Fifth Fleet was debris floating in space. Peter Kane ordered his ships to leave one Council vessel intact but crippled, its crew alive but traumatized. He wanted survivors. He wanted them to return to the Council and describe what they witnessed. He wanted the Council to understand that humanity wasn't seeking peace. They were seeking justice. Nicole Harper's ground forces launched simultaneous attacks on 3 Council colony worlds. They didn't target civilians. They struck military bases and government facilities with surgical precision. Human soldiers in powered armor moved faster and hit harder than anything the Council had encountered. Defensive positions that should have held for weeks fell in hours. Council forces surrendered or fled. The colonies themselves were left intact, their civilian populations unharmed but terrified. Nicole established occupation governments and broadcast a message to the Council. Withdraw from human territory or more worlds would fall. The Council responded by declaring humanity a galactic threat and calling for total war against all human populations. Nicole smiled when she heard the declaration. The Council had just united every human under a single cause and legitimized everything humanity was about to do. The destruction of the Fifth Fleet sent shockwaves through Council territories that went far beyond the military implications. For 3,000 years, the Council had maintained absolute dominance through a combination of superior technology, overwhelming numbers, and the belief that no force in the galaxy could challenge their authority. Humanity shattered that belief in 17 minutes. Suddenly, every species that the Council had ever threatened, every colony that chafed under Council rules, every faction that harbored resentment saw an opportunity. The cracks in the Council's perfect facade began to widen into chasms. Admiral Peter Kane pressed his advantage with calculated ruthlessness. His fleet struck deep into Council territory, hitting targets that were supposed to be unreachable. Supply depots vanished overnight. Communication hubs went offline without warning. Military installations were destroyed before they could respond to threats. Human ships appeared and disappeared like ghosts, striking from quantum shadows and vanishing before Council forces could counterattack. Every attack was documented and broadcast across the galaxy, showing Council weakness to billions of watching civilians. The message was clear. The Council could not protect its own territories, much less police the galaxy. General Nicole Harper commanded ground operations with similar efficiency. Her soldiers didn't occupy conquered worlds. They struck military targets, eliminated defensive capabilities, and withdrew before reinforcements could arrive. Council military commanders found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to hold territory or present targets for counterattack. Traditional military doctrine was useless against an opponent that could attack anywhere and retreat into spaces that sensors couldn't penetrate. Harper's forces grew bolder with each victory, striking deeper into Council space and demonstrating that no world was safe from human retaliation. Dr. Simon Wells orchestrated a different kind of warfare that proved equally devastating. He studied 3,000 years of Council politics and identified every fault line, every ancient grievance, every suppressed conflict. The Council maintained peace by threatening mutual destruction, but that threat only worked if everyone believed the Council had the power to enforce it. Humanity had proven the Council was vulnerable. Wells began exploiting that vulnerability with surgical precision. He sent carefully crafted messages to the Vaxian Imperium, reminding them that the Council once threatened them with the same treatment Earth received. He provided the Keltorians with evidence that the Council planned to annex their resource-rich worlds. He showed the Archon Collective proof that other Council species were violating treaties while the Archons faithfully followed every rule. The Council's response to these challenges revealed how deeply their power structure depended on fear and intimidation. Instead of addressing legitimate grievances or seeking peaceful solutions, Prime Arbiter Thexuler demanded absolute obedience and threatened harsh punishment for any species that questioned Council authority. Member species that expressed sympathy for humanity or called for diplomatic negotiations were sanctioned or expelled. Civilian populations that protested the war were suppressed by Council security forces. The crystalline being who ruled the Council for 4,000 years believed that strength and authority were synonymous, never understanding that true strength came from unity and cooperation. His harsh response only accelerated the Council's collapse. Within 6 months of the first human strike, 12 Council species formally withdrew from the conflict and declared neutrality. They didn't join humanity, but they refused to commit forces against human targets. The Council's 8th Fleet, composed primarily of ships from these neutral species, effectively dissolved overnight. 3 more species went further and signed non-aggression pacts with humanity, promising to share intelligence about Council military movements in exchange for guaranteed protection. Peter Kane accepted these offers and kept his promises. Human forces defended neutral worlds from Council retaliation, demonstrating that humanity honored agreements and protected allies. This was the opposite of how the Council operated, and the contrast was not lost on watching species. The Vaxian Imperium made the most dramatic move. Their leadership had been debating for decades whether to remain in the Council or pursue independence. Humanity's success provided the catalyst they needed. In a bold declaration broadcast across the galaxy, the Vaxians announced their withdrawal from the Council and their alliance with humanity. They committed 200 warships to joint operations against Council targets. More importantly, they shared complete intelligence about Council military deployments, defense systems, and strategic plans. The Vaxians had been one of the Council's strongest military powers. Their defection shifted the balance of power dramatically in humanity's favor. Prime Arbiter Thexular attempted to make an example of the Vaxians by deploying the Second Fleet to bombard their homeworld. Peter Kane was waiting. Human and Vaxian forces ambushed the Second Fleet as it entered the Vaxian system. The battle was even shorter than the Fifth Fleet engagement. Council ships found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned, and overwhelmed by combined human-Vaxian tactics. When the Second Fleet tried to retreat, human ships pursued relentlessly and destroyed every vessel. Not a single Council ship escaped. The message to other species was unmistakable. Humanity would defend its allies with the same determination it pursued its enemies. Species considering leaving the Council suddenly had less to fear and more to gain. The war continued for 2 years of grinding attrition that slowly destroyed the Council's ability to maintain control. Nicole Harper's ground forces captured strategic locations across dozens of worlds. Human fleets controlled major shipping lanes and trade routes. Simon Wells coordinated resistance movements on Council worlds, providing weapons and training to populations that had been suppressed for centuries. The Council still commanded significant military resources, but those resources were scattered and demoralized. Soldiers began questioning why they were fighting to preserve a system that clearly wasn't working. Officers defected to humanity or simply deserted their posts. Entire battle groups surrendered without firing a shot. Thexular became increasingly isolated as the Council membership dwindled. Species that once sat in judgment of others quietly withdrew to protect their own interests. The Grand Chamber that once held 73 representatives from different civilizations now held fewer than 30, and many of those were preparing to leave. The crystalline being who ordered Earth's erasure 3,000 years ago found himself presiding over a dying empire. His authority crumbling and his vision of galactic peace revealed as nothing more than enforced submission. He called for total war against humanity, but fewer and fewer species answered his call. Peter Kane watched the Council's collapse with satisfaction, but also with caution. Destroying the Council was never the goal. Creating a power vacuum in the galaxy would only lead to chaos and more suffering. Humanity needed to offer an alternative, a better vision for how different species could coexist. He began reaching out to neutral and allied species with proposals for a new governing structure, one based on cooperation rather than domination. The response was cautious but interested. Species that had lived under Council authority for millennia were nervous about change, but they could see that the old system was finished. The Archon Collective, the crystalline species that had always been uncomfortable with aggressive Council policies, became humanity's most important diplomatic partner. They had significant influence among moderate Council members and respect across the galaxy for their wisdom and fairness. The Archons proposed a summit where humanity and remaining Council members could negotiate a peaceful transition. Thexular rejected the proposal immediately, but his rejection no longer mattered. Over 40 species accepted the invitation and began preparing delegations. The summit would be held on a neutral world, protected by human and Archon security forces, and it would determine the future of galactic civilization. Nicole Harper warned Peter that Thexular wouldn't give up power peacefully. The Prime Arbiter had ruled for 4,000 years and watched his empire expand across the galaxy. He wouldn't accept defeat even when defeat was inevitable. She recommended preparing for a final confrontation, a last desperate attempt by Thexular to prove Council superiority. Peter agreed and positioned his strongest battle groups near Zenith 7, the Council headquarters. If Thexular wanted a final battle, humanity would give him one. But Peter hoped it wouldn't come to that. Enough blood had been spilled. Enough lives had been lost. It was time for the galaxy to move forward, with or without the Galactic Council's blessing. The summit took place on a world called Haven's Rest, a peaceful planet chosen specifically because it had no military significance and no history of conflict. Representatives from 47 species gathered in a newly constructed conference facility, protected by combined human and Archon security forces. Admiral Peter Kane led the human delegation alongside General Nicole Harper and Dr. Simon Wells. They arrived prepared for negotiations, but also prepared for treachery. 3,000 years of survival had taught humanity never to trust completely and always to have backup plans. The stakes were too high for mistakes. This summit would either create a new framework for galactic civilization or collapse into violence that might destroy everything humanity had fought to achieve. The Archon representative, a being named Cyrnel, opened the proceedings by acknowledging the failures of the old council system. The council had maintained order through fear and threats rather than cooperation and mutual benefit. It had silenced dissent, punished independence, and committed atrocities in the name of galactic peace. Earth's erasure was not an isolated incident, but rather the most extreme example of a pattern that had repeated throughout council history. Species that didn't conform were threatened, suppressed, or eliminated. The Archons themselves had protested these methods for centuries, but their objections were ignored or overruled by more aggressive council members. Now the system had finally collapsed under its own contradictions, and the galaxy needed something better to replace it. Peter Kane stood before the assembled representatives and presented humanity's vision for the future. The Galactic Assembly would replace the old council, with fundamental differences in structure and philosophy. Every member species would have equal voting rights regardless of their military power or technological advancement. Decisions would require consensus rather than simple majority, forcing species to negotiate and compromise. Most importantly, the right to exist would be universal and inviolable. No species could ever again be threatened with erasure, simply because others found them inconvenient or dangerous. The Assembly would maintain peacekeeping forces and arbitrate disputes, but it would never have the authority to eliminate entire civilizations. Survival was a right, not a privilege to be granted or revoked by the powerful. The proposal generated intense debate. Some species worried that consensus requirements would make the Assembly ineffective and unable to respond to genuine threats. Others questioned whether humanity, having just defeated the Council militarily, would actually honor the equal partnership they promised, or simply become the new dominant power. The Keltorians pointed out that humanity still maintained the largest and most advanced military force in the galaxy. What guarantee did anyone have that humans wouldn't use that force to impose their will just as the Council had? These were legitimate concerns that Peter addressed directly rather than dismissing them. Humanity would reduce its military forces by half over the next decade, Peter promised. The weapons that made human ships so devastating would be shared with all Assembly members, ensuring no single species maintained technological superiority. Human territory would be open to inspection and oversight by Assembly peacekeepers. Most importantly, humanity would submit to the same laws and restrictions as every other species. If humans violated Assembly protocols, they would face the same consequences as anyone else. Nicole Harper stood beside Peter and added that humanity's goal was never to dominate the galaxy, but to ensure that what happened to Earth never happened to anyone else. They had fought for survival and justice, not conquest. Now they wanted peace, but peace built on equality rather than subjugation. The debate continued for 3 days. Smaller species worried about being dominated by larger ones. Aggressive species chafed at restrictions on military expansion. Former Council loyalists struggled to accept that the old system was truly finished. But slowly, painfully, consensus began to emerge. The alternative to the Assembly was chaos, and chaos would be worse for everyone. Simon Wells worked tirelessly behind the scenes, mediating disputes and finding compromises that different factions could accept. The Archons lent their moral authority to the process, assuring nervous species that humanity's promises were genuine. By the end of the 3rd day, 39 species had formally agreed to join the Assembly. 8 more committed to joining after consulting with their governments. The new galactic order was taking shape. One notable absence from the summit was Prime Arbiter Thexular and the remaining Council loyalists. They refused to participate in what they called an illegal gathering, organized by terrorists and traitors. Thexular issued declarations from Zenith 7, stating that the Council remained the legitimate galactic authority and that all species must return to obedience. His proclamations were largely ignored. The few species still loyal to the Council did so out of fear or habit rather than conviction. Nicole Harper reported that Council military forces near Zenith 7 were preparing for a final confrontation. Thexular apparently believed that one decisive victory could reverse humanity's gains and restore Council authority. Peter authorized defensive preparations but ordered his forces not to attack first. If the Council wanted to end this peacefully, humanity would allow it. But if Thexular chose violence, humanity would finish what the Council started 3,000 years ago. The confrontation came 2 weeks after the summit concluded. Thexular gathered what remained of Council forces, approximately 300 ships representing the last loyalist species, and led them in an assault on a human colony world called New Terra. The attack was meant to demonstrate that the Council could still strike at humanity, and that species joining the assembly would face retaliation. The assault failed spectacularly. Human defense forces destroyed half the Council fleet within minutes. The remainder retreated in disorder, pursued by human ships that had been positioned specifically to respond to this kind of attack. Peter Kane ordered his forces to disable rather than destroy the fleeing ships where possible. He wanted prisoners, not martyrs. Nicole Harper's Marines boarded the damaged Council vessels and took thousands of prisoners, including several high-ranking officers and political leaders. They were transported to New Terra and held in comfortable but secure facilities. Peter visited the prisoners personally, speaking with them about the war and its causes. Many expressed confusion about why they were being treated well. They expected execution or torture based on Council propaganda about human savagery. Peter explained that humanity fought for justice and survival, not revenge. The Council had erased Earth and forced humans to become warriors. But now the war was over, and prisoners would be returned to their homeworlds once peace was formalized. This act of mercy had more impact on galactic opinion than any military victory could have achieved. Thexular himself refused to surrender. The crystalline being barricaded himself inside Council headquarters on Zenith 7, along with a few dozen loyalists, and demanded that the galaxy recognize his authority. Peter Kane brought the Retribution to orbit above the station, accompanied by representatives from the new assembly. They offered Thexular safe passage to anywhere he wished to go, if he would simply step down peacefully. The Prime Arbiter refused. He had ruled for 4,000 years and would not surrender his authority to primitives and traitors. Peter gave him 24 hours to reconsider. When the deadline passed with no response, human forces stormed the station. The assault was swift and professional. Human soldiers neutralized the few guards still loyal to Thexular and secured the facility within an hour. They found the Prime Arbiter in the Grand Council chamber, sitting alone in the seat where he once commanded 73 species. Peter Kane entered the chamber and stood before the being who ordered Earth's erasure 3,000 years ago. Thexular looked at the human admiral with something like curiosity, studying the species that had accomplished what no other civilization ever managed. He asked Peter a simple question. How had humanity survived when they should have died? How had they thrived when they should have been crushed? How had they defeated an empire that ruled the galaxy for millennia? Peter considered the question carefully before answering. Humanity survived because the Council gave them no choice. When you erase someone's homeworld, when you kill 9 billion people for the crime of being different, you create an enemy that will never stop fighting. The Council believed they were eliminating a threat, but they were actually forging a species with absolute clarity of purpose. Every human born in the centuries after Earth's erasure grew up knowing what the Council had done. They grew up determined to ensure it never happened again. That determination, combined with human adaptability and innovation, made them unstoppable. The Council's greatest mistake was not killing humanity. Their greatest mistake was trying to kill humanity and failing. Thexular was placed under assembly custody to await trial for crimes against sapient species. Peter recommended life imprisonment rather than execution. Death would make the former Prime Arbiter a martyr to his remaining followers. Life in a cell would make him a relic of a failed system, forgotten as the galaxy moved forward.